Kelvin Chan. So he's been with Dodge for over 7 years, 3 years in industrial distribution. He's solved a lot of problems, saved a lot of money, increased uptime for a lot of end users. Spent 20 years in manufacturing in different roles, design as well, management and sales. So he's got effective communication skills. I guess we'll put that to the test. And a desire to educate. So that is it. I'll let Kelvin take over, and he can kind of switch the screen over, and then basically we will get started. And then we'll do a bit of a Q&A at the end, and then we'll have food served. And Edmonton is free to ask questions as well.
All right, good to go.
You're good.
Thank you very much, Andrew. You know, thank you everyone for this opportunity to share this information with you. As my profile said, I like to educate. I love sharing information. So what we're going to talk about this evening is our ISAF spherical roller bearing. And at the very beginning of any presentations that I have, I always like to ask this question: why? Why do we exist? Why do we do this? Dodge is here to exceed customer expectations. And how do we do it? We do it by problem solving and by innovation. In fact, we've been doing this for about 140 plus years. In that time span, there's a bit of a delay, I guess. In that time span, we've designed, manufactured, and supplied mechanical power transmission products all around the globe. And what we pride ourselves on is it's having feature-rich, high quality and long lasting products. Oh, we're gonna have some fun tonight. Bear with us for a second. Bear with us for a second here. Okay. Yeah. All right, that's better. That's better. Yeah, sure. I think it's on. It's on. So this is who we are, and one important factor that really has to be stressed in the last few years is we're North American manufacturing. In fact, a lot of our plants in the US are within about a 2-hour driving radius. So that allows the plants to share knowledge, to be able to share equipment. And the majority of our products are sourced in the United States as well. So there's very few components that we have to put on a ship and bring it into the US. So in the past couple of years, that has meant a lot. It's allowed us to be able to be really prepared for some of the logistics issues that have occurred in the past couple of years. So we really take pride in the fact that we are a North American manufacturer. The other thing that we want to do is innovate. And this is another core belief that we have. We're always trying to improve products, yes, but we're also improving systems and ultimately offerings for our customers. And the goal again is our customers. We want them to perform at the highest level possible. A couple of the innovations that we've had over 140 plus years time span, Dodge created the first split wood pulley back in the late 1800s. And then in the late 1930s, we created the taper lock bushing. You see this in every sort of belt drive application throughout North America and around the world. So it's a really familiar product. In the late 40s, we created a shaft mount gear reducer. And on into the 60s, we created a rubber tire coupling, one of the first rubber tire couplings. And not to sit on our laurels, you know, we make a product, we introduce it, but we continue to improve it. So in the 1970s, the gearbox that we introduced in the 1940s, we created a twin tapered bushing locking mechanism. So it allows you to take the shaft off really easily or install it. And then in the late 90s, we developed, Dodge in-house developed a new locking device for bearings, and it was the Imperial lock. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. In the past decade, we'll say we've introduced other products focusing on specific industries like the food and bev industry, requiring higher demand for safety and cleanliness. And we've even improved on our Imperial bearing that we came up with in the late 1990s by making the safety mount. And again, we're going to talk about that this evening as well. And not to say that Dodge is completely all a mechanical company. We've dedicated resources to producing our smart sensor, which is a condition monitoring device. And that's our entry into the Industry 4.0 sphere. So our spherical ISAF, what is it all about? Throughout your facilities, you'll see a fairly common bearing. It's called the SAF. It comes in multiple pieces. It's assembled on site. There's a lot of interchangeable parts with many different manufacturers, so it makes it easily accessible to the masses. But Dodge, we found a different way of approaching the same problem. So with the SAF, the ISAF, it's the same footprint, so it's drop-in. We've introduced that Imperial adapter shaft mount to it. We have a full range of shaft sizes that we can work with. And the difference in the product is it's insert base or cartridge base. We're going to get into that in a little bit later on here. So I'm going to present 5 really good reasons that you would actually consider the ISAF mounted bearing. Here's one of them. Do you think lubrication is really important for rotating equipment? Is it important? Yes. Yeah, absolutely, right? So here's the thing, with our ISAF style bearings, these already come factory filled with grease. It's ready to go. As opposed to typical SAF bearings, which, as you see in the picture here, you're looking at having to pack the grease manually on site. So, you know, what's the first thing that you think is going to happen to this thing? So we've seen this graphic before, I'm sure of it. The majority of premature bearing failures, it's 80% of it is lubrication based, right? It's old, it's wrong, there's not enough, you name it, a solid liquid contamination. How do you mitigate that? How do you make sure that that doesn't happen? There's 3 things you should be doing. Number 1, don't introduce it in the first place. Number 2, after you install it, you want to prevent contamination from getting in, right? And third, you should have some way of actually purging eventually what's going to happen inside that bearing. The contamination is going to enter, especially if the material is really fine. It's an eventuality. So how do you get rid of that? Well, is this the environment that you work in? Does this look familiar? Maybe a little bit of an exaggeration, but not necessarily in some places. You have an open bearing you're working with here. So you're packing grease in that environment. What do you think is happening? You're introducing contamination from day one. Now, wouldn't you rather have something that just ships completely sealed, ready to go from the factory? And that's what the ISAF is. How do we do that? Well, we want to not introduce contamination, number 1. Here's the other step. We want to prevent contamination after installation. So how every bearing manufacturer lives and dies by their seals. And this is Dodge's approach. It's a triple lip seal plus a flinger. So that basically means 4 barriers of protection that restricts contamination from getting in. And in addition, there are other options for seals as well. But with this particular design, what we're trying to create is a grease dam. So you have these 4 barriers of protection plus the grease that you're gonna pack in here, right? So you really have the 5th protection is that grease dam. So you want to make sure that grease dam is clean, right? So now what's that 3rd thing that we have to do to prevent contamination? You got to find some way of actually purging this. So how do we do that? Well, in this graphic, you're going to see the difference between an SAF and ISAF in the fact that how contamination gets in or gets out. So in a traditional SAF, what you're looking at here is the housing of an SAF. There's a massive cavity on either side of that bearing inside there. So when you're pumping in fresh grease, it's a shell game. You're actually just moving the contamination over into this cavity. And then to add a little bit more pain, those LER seals are grooved. So you're moving more contamination into the groove now. So as you can imagine, how much contamination are you actually pushing out of this particular type of bearing? Now, compare that with our ISAF. So it's insert base. When you purge grease, you notice the shape of those seals are fairly unique. It's a one-way street here. We're pushing grease, it goes out with the contamination, and everything that's going with that grease is purged out. And that's what we want to do to properly maintain the life of that bearing. So how is it that we can do this? Because as you can see in this picture, you can see that grease being purged out. It's rotating. You know, that's pressurized. We're actually using some means of pressure to actually push that out. And normally with a lot of bearing seals, you apply pressure to any seal and it's popping out. That is traditional seal design. Why does this happen with Dodge and that seal is staying intact? It's not popping out. Why is that? It's because the seals are mechanically retained. So no human hand is actually touching that to insert that into the housing. It's a robot that does that. It pinches the seal so that you can apply whatever normal pressure that you would, a grease gun, an auto lubrication system, whatever it is, you're pushing that grease out with its contamination. You're getting that fresh grease, and you're getting that grease dam, that fresh grease dam as well. So those are three things that are related to lubrication that really restrict contamination with our design. Oh, by the way, well, let's talk about how much grease you're going to use. The factory knows how much grease fills that insert, and they're going to get exactly the right amount all the time, right? So in the field, when that bearing, that SAF bearing is open, what are you doing with the grease? So you're buying 5 times the grease to actually pack this thing in that exposed contamination-based environment. And you know, the funny thing is, I would hope the first thing that you do after you pack all that grease with all that crap is you're purging it out. Does anybody do that? That's not the first step. So realistically, I mean, you could be spending 10 times as much grease to actually make sure that you're doing it right. So what other things should you consider an ISAF for? Well, it's one part number, right? This is an example. Dodge makes SAF bearings as well, absolutely. These are our part numbers. Notice there's multiple part numbers versus the one part number. So here's the interesting about the SAF bearings. Remember I said that they're global. Any manufacturer makes SAF bearing parts, but you don't necessarily know who that manufacturer is. There's no way of knowing their quality control. There's no way of you knowing exactly where that comes from. When that panic happens in your plant and you're scrambling for these parts, you will work with anything you want, right? Or anything you can get your hands on, right? So you're going to get a mishmash of all sorts of different manufacturers. So there's an inherent risk in doing that, where you can't be confident necessarily in all the components that you're choosing to be part of this bearing assembly. What's another good reason? How about this? It's easy to install. You guys know what feeler gauges are? How many of you have actually worked with feeler gauges? Yeah? You have a skill set. If you've worked with feeler gauges, you have a very particular skill set. And it's an absolute rarity to know how to do this effectively, properly, right? So ISAF bearings, no feeler gauges. You don't have to stick those feeler gauges in here. I'll show you how to take the clearance out of these things. This is the steps. There's 4 steps to making sure that you take out clearance, check the clearance, etc., etc. And these 4 steps, you may have to repeat them, right? If you don't get that clearance out, you're going to have to repeat this, right? And as the bore, the shaft size gets larger, it gets a little bit more difficult to do this process. You require more people, you require more time, right? So how do you install a Dodge ISAF? Turn something clockwise. That's it. That's all you're doing. In fact, you're hand tightening it to a 0 reference. And then I have a chart that tells you whatever diameter it is, you put it through a couple more turns, either with a spanner wrench that has leverage or a hammer and drift. That's how you mount it. No feeler gauges. This actually takes the clearance out, sets it for you perfectly. And how does that happen? Well, if you focus on the blue wedge there, so when you hand turn it, I don't know if the graphic's going to work for me today, but when you hand turn it, oh yes, it moves, right? It pushes. And then when you use that spanner wrench or hammer and drift, you're locking it into place. Oh, see what happens? Okay, we'll back it up here. So what happens is it pulls. So that's why we call this a push-pull adapter. That effectively sets the clearance for you. You don't have to worry about feeler gauges. Another good reason. Well, just as easy as it is to mount, it's easy to dismount as well. With traditional SAF bearings, there's a challenge. There's a real challenge with dismounting these bearings. So how do we do it with our ISAFs? Counterclockwise, same process. This is one way to remove an SAF bearing. Don't know if the sound will go through, but so how many of you have actually seen that before? Yes? Winner. Yeah, you may have done this yourself. What in a facility, what does this require? You're going to need some sort of permitting, right? This is hot work, right? You're going to need time. You're probably going to need a new shaft after you do this, right? So look, with the ISAF, this isn't how you dismount. This is a lot easier to work with, right? Here's another nice little video you can see. Have you seen this? That's too painful to watch completely. So we'll just cut it short there. This is another way of unlocking that adapter from that shaft, right? That's usually the first resort before you take that torch out. Another good reason I'm going to share with you. Last one. This is about misalignment. So with the ISAFs, there is plus or minus 1 degree of misalignment. We all live in a perfect world. No such thing as a misalignment, right? Right. So when you're working with an SAF style, there is no capability for that seal to handle that misalignment. So what the difference is with the ISAF is that seal is contacting 100% all the time, and it's an inserter cartridge that moves with the shaft. So does the seal. It's moving with the whole insert. So that's where that misalignment capability comes about, right? With an SAF, you can go a little bit off kilter. Now you're depending on the seal to deform in a way that it was never designed to handle misalignment. So that can be dangerous, right? You go too far and that seal just opens up, right? Here's a success story that we had in an asphalt plant. So the application was a dryer. They were using an 110 millimeter SAF. We have a dirty environment, of course. This particular design needed a different type of seal, which does the same thing as what we have with that triple lip seal. It just handles higher speeds and the temperature as well. It's application based, so if you've got questions about that, we can talk about it after. But in this particular case, there was a 12-month life cycle for this bearing. And what did that cost? It's 40 euro per ton, which works out to about 4,800 euro per hour. What did ISAF do for them? So they doubled their previous life. That means 24 months plus. And of course, they prevented any sort of unplanned downtime because they weren't sure when within that 12-month cycle that SAF bearing was going to fail. That's where good condition monitoring works, right? So is there a way that we could improve this design? Why would we need to? Would we really need to? This is the third core principle that Dodge has. It's we make high quality products, yes, but we want to do it in the safest possible manner. If we can increase the safety level of that product as you're installing it, we will find the way. And this is what we did, because even, remember our buddy here with the torch? Even with our locking mechanism, the Imperial locking mechanism, what's going to happen is that, you are still using a hammer and drift, right? Or a large spanner wrench, and that can be dangerous too, right? You're causing a potential sparking or whatever you're doing when you're actually hammering the locking mechanism down. So there's an inherent risk as well, just like an SAF. So what we've done at Dodge is find something that was faster, easier, but also safer. And lo and behold, we're just using hex caps now. No spanner wrench, no hammer and drift. And so basically it's tightening and loosening tightening hex caps. So it's the same SAF footprint. It's the same replaceable insert. It's the same seal system that we're using, except instead of having to deal with now that hammer and drift or spanner wrench or any sort of blows, what you're working with is a hex cap system. So these ship with these hex caps attached. So what you're doing is you're basically hand tightening it, just like our normal Imperial adapters. You're marking alignment, then you loosen the hex cap bolts. But you notice it's an integral nut. So you're basically moving it to the other side of the slot, and then you're tightening it after that using torque. So it's a really simple system. And when you're dealing with diameters of like 4 and 15/16 to 7 inches, it's not massive, but it's still a good size. You need a lot of leverage or a lot of hammer blows to turn that locking mechanism. So this safety mount does it a lot easier, safer, and to dismount, you're doing the opposite. You're moving the hex head bolts, but we also have jack screws. So you're disengaging the external nut from the internal nut. Makes it a lot much easier, and we're giving you an assistance here to actually help out with that. So this definitely is about safety to ensure that no one's getting hurt at the end of the day. Can we improve on that? Okay, what happens if you're dealing with a shaft diameter of 7 inches to like 15 inches? How do you deal with something that large? There's some pretty serious work to be done on that. This is why we introduced the hydraulic ISAF. So, same idea, except hydraulic pistons is what we're using. So you're hooking this up to a power pack to disengage the locking mechanism or engage the locking mechanism, whichever you're doing. So the safety mount, this hydraulic ISAF, they're all the same in the fact that there's no feeler gauges again, right? They're replaceable inserts. That limits your critical spares. You don't have to have the whole block sitting on a shelf. Now all you would need is the actual insert. So that ultimately reduces your costs and reduces your inventory. Here's a really nice success story from CSX. This is a loadout facility in Toledo. It's an iron ore loadout facility. So they were using SAFs, and the installation time was 48 hours. You can imagine that. and they had challenges setting clearance, bearing failures, things like that. And how did they actually solve it? Well, you know what? I'm just gonna bounce out of here because this is one of those success stories that I like to read. I'm gonna read verbatim what this Ron Davenport said about this installation. He said, keeping the bearing from being contaminated in the outdoors is nearly impossible. Would you agree with that? A bearing changeout never seems to happen on a nice day. It's usually raining or snowing, and that makes it tough on the team. Plus, you really have to know what you are doing, especially understanding how to set the tolerances just right. We spent a solid 48 hours changing out that bearing. Not only is it a fight to get a failed bearing off, but the bearing also destroyed the shaft. So it had to be changed out as well. That's when I seriously began considering using the Dodge hydraulic ISAF bearing because I knew there had to be a better way. And just maybe this was it. Oops. There we go. Sorry. So those were his words, not mine. It's printed, published. I read verbatim what he said. And this is his conclusion here. It says, believe me, installing a bearing has never gone as smoothly as this. So what have they been able to do with this bearing? So remember 48 hours, right? 48 hours to install this thing. They cut it down to 4 hours. So that's cut by 12. Did it work? Yeah, they moved 3 million tons of ore already with this bearing in place. It worked. So just a quick summary, why would you consider ISAFs? Well, it's one package, not 100 different part numbers. It's factory sealed. You cannot introduce contamination into this system. The cost of grease, the amount of grease that you're using would be excessive for the SAF versus the ISAF. The factory knows how much to put in it perfectly. And the actual seal system is really what shines in this because it's purgeable. It prevents and it allows you to refresh as well. And the big thing here, feeler gauges. No more feeler gauges. So that being said, it's easier to install and easier to remove. So, any questions?